Old age is an inevitable stage of life that many fear. But the greatest fear is not age itself, but the loneliness that often accompanies it. A person may be healthy, have a home, and financial security, but without someone by their side, all of this loses meaning. Loneliness in old age is a topic rarely discussed openly, as it is uncomfortable and even painful. We are used to imagining old age as a time of rest, peace, and wisdom. But what happens when this time turns into silence that no one disturbs? Society does not like to talk about the fact that many elderly people are left alone. Their calls go unanswered, and their doors remain closed. But let's face the truth. Does old age have to be like this? Or can something be changed? Part 1. A home that became empty. Svetlana always filled the space around her with life. In her youth, her house was full of laughter, conversations, and warmth. She loved hosting guests, setting the table, organizing family dinners, and gathering friends for holidays. She worked as a teacher and was always surrounded by people, students, colleagues, and acquaintances. Her life was filled with emotions, events, and meetings. But time passed. Her children grew up and moved to different cities, building their own lives. They called her, but with each year, the calls became fewer. They had their own families, worries, and affairs. Her husband fell ill and passed away. Svetlana tried to maintain her usual life, meeting with friends, going to the market just to talk to the sellers, and visiting the library. But over time, her circle of acquaintances began to narrow rapidly. Friends passed away or moved closer to their children, and some could no longer leave their homes due to health issues. Svetlana was left alone in a large house, where every corner reminded her of the past. Her mornings used to begin with preparing breakfast for the whole family, the clinking of cups, the clatter of spoons against dishes, and conversations. Now, she woke up late because she saw no point in rushing. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, looking out the window where people walked, and then slowly went to the kitchen, where only one cup awaited her own, to fill the emptiness. She often turned on the TV. Its sound somewhat broke the heavy, oppressive silence. She watched programs, listened to strangers' voices, and even responded to them aloud, as if talking to the hosts. But when she turned off the screen, the silence covered her again, like a heavy blanket. Svetlana began talking to herself, not because she had lost her mind, but because there was no one else to share her thoughts with. She commented on the news aloud, remembered the past, and asked herself how her husband would have acted in this or that situation. It even seemed to her that he was still there, just in another room. Sometimes she opened an old photo album, flipped through the yellowed pages, and looked at the faces of those who were no longer with her. She remembered how they went to the movies together, walked in the evenings, and laughed loudly at jokes that no one cares about now. One day, she decided to call her daughter. After several long rings, her granddaughter finally answered, "Hello, Grandma." "Hi, Mom. I'm just calling to talk." "Oh, Grandma, I'm very busy right now. Let's talk later, okay?" The call ended, and later never came. Svetlana did not take offense. She understood that the young have their own lives and problems. But deep down, a longing grew. A longing for the time when she was needed, when people sought her company, called her, visited her, and shared their news. One day, she heard children playing on the street. Their laughter reminded her of her own children who once ran around the yard. She went out to the porch, looked at them, sighed, and smiled. The children did not even notice the grandmother standing by the door. They lived in their own world, where she was just a shadow. In the evening, she sat by the window and looked at the city that lived its own life. Lights in the houses turned on and off. People hurried home, met, talked, and somewhere in the distance, laughter rang out. Someone cheerfully discussed plans, someone waited for guests, and in her house, it was quiet. Very quiet. She thought, how did this happen? Why am I no longer needed? She did not know what tomorrow would bring, whether it would be the same as yesterday, whether the phone would ring again, or whether she would drink coffee alone and turn on the TV to somehow fill the silence. But she knew that this was not just her story. It was the story of thousands of people who were once needed, but are now left alone in their empty houses. Part 2. When the phone doesn't ring. Petro spent his entire life working. He not only treated people, but was someone they trusted, someone they turned to, not just for medical help, but also for advice, support, and understanding. His patients and colleagues respected him, and his friends knew they could call him at any time and receive wise advice. He was used to his phone almost never being silent. Patients called, "Doctor, my blood pressure is up again. What should I do?" Or, "Doctor, thank you. I just wanted to say thank you." Friends called, "Petro, help me. My neighbor has problems, and there's no one else to turn to." Relatives called, "Come to the celebration. We're waiting for you." He liked being needed. But the years passed. He retired, giving way to younger colleagues. At first, they still called him, asked how he was doing, and invited him to professional celebrations. He felt that they still remembered him. But with each passing year, the calls became fewer. At first, he thought it was a coincidence. People were busy with their own affairs. But then he noticed that even his former patients no longer sought his advice. Perhaps they found other doctors. One day, he realized his phone had been silent for several weeks. At first, he decided to call an old friend with whom he had worked for many years. After several long rings, a hoarse voice finally answered, "Petro, I'm sorry. I'm busy right now. I'll call you back later." Later never came. He called his son. "Hello, Dad. How are you?" "I'm fine, son. I just wanted to talk." "Oh, I'm at work right now. I'll call you back later." And that later never came either. He opened his phone book and began flipping through the contacts. Once, these numbers belonged to people who were an important part of his life, but now they were just lines of text on the screen. Why did this happen? He thought. Was I only important when I could be useful? His gaze fell on an old notebook where he had written numbers in his youth. He flipped through the pages. Many of these people were no longer alive. Some had moved away, and others had simply been lost in the whirlwind of life. He sat in his favorite chair by the window, looking at the phone, hoping it would finally ring, but no new calls appeared on the screen to dispel the silence. He turned on the TV. They were talking about new technologies, about a world that was changing. He thought, maybe I just don't fit into this new world. Maybe I'm stuck in the past, and people no longer need me. He remembered how, just a few years ago, they invited him to celebrations. He always brought interesting stories, could make the company laugh, and gave wise advice. Now, they no longer invited him. Maybe he had become uninteresting. Maybe he was just old. The next day, he decided to go for a walk in the park. He saw young people talking animatedly. They laughed, scrolled through their phones, and shared news. He sat down on a bench nearby and tried to just listen. One of the guys noticed him and said to his friends, "Look, the old man is probably eavesdropping on us." They laughed and then returned to their conversation. Petro sighed. He had no intention of eavesdropping. He just wanted to feel like part of life. In the evening, he sat in his chair again. He no longer expected a call. He realized there was nothing left to wait for. There was a time when he was needed, but that time had passed. and now his phone was silent. Part 3. Social media won't replace. Hugs. Maria never considered herself a person who was good with modern technology. She was born in a time when people wrote letters by hand, and phone calls were an event. In her youth, communication was real, over a cup of tea, during a walk, or in long conversations in the kitchen. She remembered those times when friends would drop by without an invitation, when neighbors could just stop by for a moment and stay for hours. But the world changed. Her children and grandchildren spent more and more time on their phones. She watched as they sat next to each other, but didn't talk. Instead, they scrolled through news feeds. She didn't understand this and tried to engage them in conversation, but the answer was always the same. "Grandma, I'm busy right now." One day, her granddaughter said, "Grandma, you should join social media too. We'll teach you." Maria was skeptical but agreed. She never thought she would learn something new at 70, but she was curious. She created a profile, added a photo from her youth, and began writing short reflections on life. Over time, she found acquaintances she hadn't seen in years. They corresponded, shared memories, and Maria liked it. She received comments, likes, and even strangers read her posts. She felt important, as if she had a voice again. Her blog became popular among older people. She wrote about how the world was changing, shared simple life stories, and even gave advice to her subscribers. The comments were warm and kind. People wrote, "Maria, thank you for your stories. You are so wise. I read you every day." Sometimes it even seemed to her that she was not alone. But one day, she fell ill. It was just a cold, but at her age, even such minor ailments could be dangerous. She felt weak, her head was spinning, and it was difficult for her to even get out of bed to make herself some tea. She opened her phone and wrote a post. "Dear friends, I'm not feeling well today. I hope to get better soon." Comments quickly appeared under the post. "Get well soon. Sending you warm hugs." These words were pleasant, but they did not feed her, bring her warm tea, or help her get out of bed. Maria looked at the phone and realized that in the virtual world, everyone wished her well. But in the real world, the doors of her apartment remained closed. She remembered how, when one of her friends was ill, she would take a bag, buy fresh groceries, bring soup, talk, and support them. She remembered how her neighbor Hannah would come with treats when she herself was unwell. And now, her photo received dozens of likes, but no one knocked on her door. After a few days, she felt better. She went outside and sat on a bench near her house. People walked by. Some hurriedly scrolled through their phones. Others talked on headsets, not even noticing the elderly woman sitting nearby. She suddenly realized that this world lived by new rules. Here, it was no longer acceptable to just drop by for a visit. Here, people wrote more than they talked. They supported with words, but not with actions. That evening, Maria opened social media and wrote a short message. "The online world is wonderful, but it will never replace real hugs." She received many likes, but the doors of her apartment remained closed. Part 4. Loneliness that could have been avoided. Loneliness in old age is not inevitable. Life changes, people pass away, children grow up and become busy with their own affairs. But there are those who, even in old age, do not feel abandoned. They find support, communication, and warmth. Why is this so? The thing is, even in youth, they built relationships, cherished friendships, and did not lose touch with loved ones. They did not wait for someone to remember them first. They themselves called, invited guests, and showed interest in others' lives. Alexander worked as an engineer all his life. He was not very sociable, and did not like noisy companies, but he always maintained friendly relationships with his colleagues. They went fishing together, celebrated birthdays, and helped each other. And when he retired, his life did not become empty. He did not disappear from sight. He himself called, initiated meetings, and invited someone over every Saturday. Sometimes it was old friends, sometimes new acquaintances he met in the park or at the library. He loved to talk, listen to others' stories, and share his own thoughts. His children lived far away, but he did not complain. He understood that they had their own lives, but he maintained contact with them. He did not wait for them to call first. He called himself and did not take offense if they were busy. He simply asked when it would be convenient to talk. When he fell ill, he did not have to write on social media or wait for a chance call. His friends came themselves, brought medicine, cooked dinner, and supported him, not because he asked, but because they knew Alexander would do the same for them. And there was Galina, a teacher who never allowed herself to be confined to four walls. She always believed that friendship needed to be nurtured like a flower. She did not let her connections fade when her colleagues retired. She organized class reunions, wrote to old friends, and even made new acquaintances. She was one of those people who called just to ask, "How are you?" And it was important. Galina knew that you couldn't just wait for someone to remember you. You had to remind them yourself, not intrusively, not annoyingly, but sincerely. She often said, "If you don't want to be lonely in old age, take care of your relationships while you're young." Her house was always open. Friends dropped by for tea, neighbors stopped by to chat, and she even made new acquaintances in line at the store, on a bench near the house, or on public transport. One day, someone asked her, "Why are you never lonely?" She smiled and replied, "Because I don't wait for people to come to me. I go to them myself." And this is true. Loneliness in old age is not a sentence. It can be avoided. But for this, it is important to start building relationships now, value friendship, support loved ones, not wait for the first step from others, but show initiative yourself. After all, human connections are not about the number of contacts in your phone book or subscribers on social media, but about those who are truly ready to come when needed. Old age is not just about age. It is about the feeling that you are not alone, that there are people who will remember you when the phone is silent, and who will knock on your door even if you don't ask. If you liked this video, leave a 10 in the comments. If not, leave a 0. Your opinion is very important to us. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.